And the gospel reading comes to us from Mark chapter 3, verses 20 to 35. So this is a very early part of Mark's gospel, and Jesus is basically starting his ministry. And before this, he performed miracles, and he healed lots of people. He called his 12 disciples, and this is what happens next. And he actually went home after all the busy time, and this is what happens. And the crowd came together again, so that they could not even eat. When his family heard it, they went out to restrain him, for people were saying, "He has gone out of his mind." And the scribes who came down from Jerusalem said, "He has Beelzebul, and by the ruler of the demons, he casts out demons." And he called them to him and spoke to them in parables.
How can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. And if Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot stand, but his end has come. But no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his property without first tying up the strong man. Then indeed the house can be plundered. Truly, I tell you, people will be forgiven for their sins and whatever blasphemies they utter. But whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit can never have forgiveness, but is guilty of an eternal sin, for they had said, "He has an unclean spirit."
Then his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. A crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, "Your mother and your brothers and sisters are outside asking for you." And he replied,
"Who are my mother and my brothers?"
And looking at those who sat around him, he said,
"Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother."
Hearing is the good news. Thanks be to God. Have you ever had your credibility challenged? It happens to the best of us. It happens whether we are professors, doctors, and even ministers. When the Scarborough Presbytery did a pulpit exchange for ministers, I went down to a church at the south end of Scarborough to preach. After the service, one elderly woman came up to me and thanked me for the sermon. Then she confessed, "When you got up to the pulpit, I was not even sure whether you could speak English properly." I take some comfort in the fact that I am not alone in this struggle. Even Jesus had a credibility problem. In Mark chapter 3, Jesus was on a roll. He healed a man with a withered hand, but on a Sabbath. He then went to the lakeside where a great multitude gathered around him. The people came from all over various regions: Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea, beyond the Jordan, and the region around Tyre and Sidon. There were so many gathered that he went inside a boat just to create some space between himself and the crowd. Then he began to heal the people. Mark also reported that whenever the unclean spirits saw him, they fell down before him and shouted, "You are the Son of God." This means that it happened a multitude of times. Then he climbed a mountain, and up there, where the mountain air is cooler and thinner, he officially called the 12 disciples. Then after that, Jesus needed a break. So he did what any of us might do. He went home to his family to catch his breath, eat some home-cooked meals, and sleep in his own bed. The problem was that the crowd showed up at his home as well. The people would not leave him alone. He could not even eat. This time, however, the problem was even more severe. The family wanted to restrain Jesus because they heard some people who said he has gone out of his mind. His family, his blood, his first love wanted to curtail Jesus' ministry. The family believed what some people were saying about Jesus, and they were embarrassed. They feared what their neighbors thought of him. In other words, Jesus' family threw him under a horse-drawn buggy. When I was in theology school, we were fortunate enough to have a middle-aged woman as a fellow student, and who also decided to live amongst us in the student residence. She played a motherly role, and all of us appreciated her very much. I remember asking her one time, "What brought you the greatest joy in life? And what brought you the greatest pain in your life?" She thought about it for a moment, and then she replied, "Family and family." The situation got even worse when these so-called know-it-all scribes from Jerusalem came down to accuse Jesus that he was possessed by Beelzebul, which enabled him to heal the people and cast out the unclean spirits. Beelzebul literally means the Lord of the Flies. The accusation was that Satan was in him that gave him the ability. It is astounding the lies people make up in order to condemn others. In the book People of the Lie, author Scott M. Peck stated that evil and lies go hand in hand. As for Jesus, foxes have holes and birds have the nests, but poor Jesus, he really did not have any place to rest his head, not even in his home. Though Jesus was trying his best to be compassionate, to heal the people who were suffering, though he was trying to preach the good news, he was accused of doing the work of the devil. You can't get any lower than that to discredit without any proof whatsoever. So how does Jesus respond? He skillfully responds with a parable. How can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. And if Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot stand. But his end has come. So how can Satan cast out Satan? If the answer is no, then there's no case. If the answer is yes, then it will fall. Something against itself cannot stand, whether it is a nation, a house, church, or a premier soccer league. I have an aunt who lives in New Jersey, and she attends a Korean church that was renting from an American Methodist church. Back in the year 2000, when George W. Bush and Al Gore were up for the US presidential election, the church was divided. Half of the church was in favor of Bush, and the other half was in favor of Gore. The church had a serious conflict, and it was getting heated. They also realized that the church was divided, and there was no room for reconciliation. So they decided to disband. But they did a very, very generous thing. They decided to give the church to my aunt's church. So they got a free church out of the deal. I say God works in mysterious ways. In a mainline liberal church, we do not like to mention Satan. I have also heard about some other church that speaks of Satan a lot, that everywhere you turn, there was evil. I made a friend of a friend who needed psychological help because he attended a very conservative church and they really overplayed Satan. And he saw Satan everywhere and he was traumatized. Anyway, since Jesus mentioned it, we have to acknowledge that there are forces and configurations of power that hurt and dehumanize humanity. There is the power of race, which tells us to believe that one group is superior to another simply because of the skin color or cultural heritage. This past week, all of us in Canada were horrified to learn about the 215 children who were buried in the Indian residential school in Kamloops, BC. There is also the power of patriarchy, which tells us that men should dominate women. There's the power of materialism, which seduces us into thinking that having money is the ultimate goal of life and the defining measure of success. There's the power of militarism, that weapons and war bring peace and security, which justifies killing another human being. There is the power of economic growth, which tells us that it is okay to destroy the environment because it creates jobs. There are many powers and principalities in this world, and Jesus stood against them. Jesus then goes on to make some powerful statements. He says, whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit can never have forgiveness, but is guilty of an eternal sin. For Mark, blasphemy against the Holy Spirit consists of calling the work of God's Holy Spirit evil. Then Jesus said, his true family is not of blood who threw him under a bus, but whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother. Ultimately, those who are committed to doing the work of God, to live according to truth, goodness, and justice, bring true spiritual kinship. Jesus suffered a credibility problem from the scribes who thought he had the evil in him, while others thought that he was out of his mind. Even his own family was embarrassed for him. Yet he turned that situation to his own advantage as a teaching moment. As for me, I'm a little sad that the presbytery stopped organizing pulpit exchanges. It was fun to exceed the preconceived notion that I could not even speak English properly. In addition, through these exchanges, I met a high school friend in one church and my high school chemistry teacher in another. God works in mysterious ways, and we often get surprised. But are you ready and willing to take that risk? Thanks be to God.